Welcome to Magnitogorsk, Russia, one of the most depressing places to ever exist. Today it ranks among the worst polluted cities in the world. Industrial runoff has poisoned the soil and its rivers, and in 1997 it was declared an ecological disaster area. Arsenic, a chemical so toxic it has been used in biological warfare, is up to 21 times more present in the ground here today than is healthy for humans. The city is dark and dingy and suffocated by smog. But Magnitogorsk isn't even the worst of its kind in Russia. Above it are two more cities, the Arctic gulag settlements of Norilsk and Vorkuta. The Soviets built these monuments to misery in a fever of industrialization, trying to catch up with the West and beat them to the top. In doing so, they created hells on Earth. These are the Soviet Union's most depressing cities. Before moving on though, I'd like to talk a little bit about today's sponsor, MyHeritage. This is their DNA kit. It costs just €29 exclusively for Imperial viewers, and it can tell you a lot about where you come from. I'm going to do the test off camera, but first a little bit about my background. My parents are British and Belgian. My grandparents are generally Western European. However, MyHeritage could come back and tell me that I'm 4% Bulgarian. That's the thing that I like about this sort of thing. You never really know what you're in for, and there's always the potential to be surprised. To find out, I actually need to do this test and send it off, but I'll be back with the results in a second. See you then. I've just received an email. It says my DNA results are ready, so let's dive in, shall we? So, okay, 38.5% Scottish and Welsh, 34.1% English. There is a little bit of European in there, okay, 9% Dutch, and 6.3% Breton. So I'm not a sophisticated European, I'm British. I'm from the land of disappointment, rain, and vinegar-based foods. That means that either I was just a little bit unlucky with the genetic draw, or one of my parents is lying to me, because I was really expecting it to be more of a 50-50 split. If you want to see how your DNA results stack up against mine, or check out your DNA matches from all over the world, MyHeritage is running an exclusive promotion for Imperial viewers, and you can get your own DNA testing kit for just €29 or dollars by clicking on my link in the description below or scanning the QR code on screen. Just input the code Imperial at checkout and you'll get a big discount. Anyway, that's all. Let's get back into the video. The Soviet Union's most depressing cities were created in its drive to industrialize. For centuries, Russia was thought to be an industrially backward nation. In 1913, a year before the First World War broke out, Russia's industrial output stood at a mere 4.8% of the United States' when accounting for population size. Most Russians were stuck ploughing fields with oxen instead of assembling the tractors that could have been replacing them. This was a problem because, according to Soviet doctrine, industrially backward nations became economically enslaved to their more advanced capitalist overlords. So when Stalin took charge of the Soviet Union in the late 1920s, he became obsessed with modernizing the country. He began implementing a plan he hoped would industrialize the nation within 5 years, between 1928 and 1933. It was dubbed, very simply, as the 5-year plan. It hoped to double, or in some sectors more than triple, industrial capacity. However, Russia at the time simply did not have the industrial centres required to facilitate such a massive leap forward. So Soviet planners decided, in many cases, to simply build them from scratch. And that's where cities like Magnitogorsk come into being. Built in Russia's stark hinterlands, the site was selected due to its proximity to an enormous iron deposit. Located beneath the Ural mountain range, this collection of metal was so significant it registered as a magnetic anomaly. Compasses and watches in the area would cease to work correctly due to its magnetic field. The site's remote location was also chosen to keep it safe in the event of a war breaking out. The Communist Party was aware that most of their existing industry was concentrated in the west of the country, bordering European capitalist nations. Placing new developments far from the reach of the USSR's enemies made it more difficult for them to cripple her. But this was the first problem that made Magnitogorsk so depressing. It was in the middle of nowhere. Railway connections were so poor that visiting officials decided to take their chances with the USSR's less than stellar aviation safety record, fly into a nearby aerodrome, and cover the rest of the distance by car. Then there was the fact that the city basically didn't exist yet. Instead of proper homes, rail cars were provided to workers at the Magnitogorsk metallurgical plant for the first few years of its existence, while the real accommodations were being built. Mind you, it wasn't too comfortable for management either. Party functionaries ordered to the site by the state, quote, greeted the relocation notice as a personal tragedy. It was difficult, even pitiful, to forsake the comfort of one's own apartment in the busy and well-known city. And for what? To settle God knows where in the middle of some deserted mountain of the steppe. These bureaucrats were accustomed to the comforts of the big city. The cinema, the theatre, the opera. Magnitogorsk was a cultural black hole in comparison. Now their primary source of entertainment would be the frequent fistfights between forced labourers at the charming prison colony next door. In fact, the streets of Magnitogorsk were so dangerous in the first few years of its history that women were afraid to leave their rail cars at night. The local newspaper reported frequent, quote, incidents, including, but not limited to, axe murders, shootings, petty heists, and railcar break-ins. As a result, the average stay for a worker was around 82 days. If you could leave, at least for a little, you did. Its lack of appeal, coupled with a general lack of labourers, meant that many of the workers in towns like Magnitogorsk were those forcefully pressed into the labour pool. This was the reality for 3 out of every 10 peasants. They had been ripped from their communities, their families, their generational homes, and placed in cities they had no connection to. This method of populating Magnitogorsk engineered, in the long term, a stagnant society. You were there to work for the good of the Union. Enjoying yourself was secondary. Not that there was much about Magnitogorsk to enjoy in the first place. It was fundamentally flawed. Planners had initially intended for the city's residential districts to be located on the western bank of this lake, away from the mine and accompanying industry on the eastern bank. However, since connecting the two sides with a bridge and a complex public transportation system was deemed too expensive, they just decided to lump them together. To make it worse, due to a surveying error, they placed residential districts downwind from industry, ensuring that the city's residents would be choked by factory fumes. In the eyes of the Soviet government, this conflation of residential and industrial zones wasn't necessarily a bad thing. In fact, they believed it might aid in creating an ideal socialist city. The problem with current cities, as one Soviet economist put it, was that, quote, presently, the masses do not live by industry or by region. They live non-districted lives. They are spaceless, so to speak. Cities, as they are now, do not speak to the minds and hearts of the workers and peasants. To solve this, Soviet planners wanted to build an antithesis to the capitalist city, which traditionally grew around a centre of capital, such as a market square, and instead make industry the animating force behind this new metropolis. So Magnitogorsk aimed to be a workers' paradise where industry and residents lived side by side. It aimed to build communal living facilities, a modern water and sewage system, workers' clubs, libraries, reading rooms, and the most advanced implementation of Soviet architecture to date. In reality, by 1937, 8 years after its foundation, the city still had open-air sewage trenches and no permanent hospital. This, in proximity to industry, had polluted its water system and led to frequent disease outbreaks, such as malaria, scarlet fever, and typhus. The urgency of the USSR's industrialization schedule forced urban planners to take shortcuts and left very little time for them to properly plan around the constantly shifting demands of the Soviet state. Magnitogorsk, far more than any other city, direly needed diligent, patient management and a granular attention to detail due to its attempts to closely integrate people and industry. But no, the city's construction was chaotic, lacking in a coherent vision, and rife with compromise. The city would never live up to the lofty heights set out for it. Ironically, in the end, the priority was not the conditions of the worker, but instead the USSR's industrial aspirations. This meant that throughout its existence, in the words of the historian Stephen Kotkin, Magnitogorsk was a city attached to a factory, from which it derived its purpose and form. Over the succeeding decades, little would change. It was always productivity first, well-being second. In 1989, a factory representative stated, quote, "With the existing equipment, either you stop production or you destroy the air. That's the situation. And you have the plan and bonuses to consider. That's why the factory violates the directives about reducing pollution. The solution is related to reconstruction, but that would take far too long and cost far too much." As a result, Magnitogorsk ranked as third in the world for carbon monoxide output in 2012, and the third most polluted city in Russia in 2015. According to local physicians, only 1% of newborn children in the city were perfectly healthy, and the incidence rate of lung cancer was starting to overwhelm hospitals. Magnitogorsk is a dystopia born of lofty Soviet ambitions and poor planning. So what could possibly beat this monument to misery? Well, that would be the Gulag city of Norilsk. Between 1935 and 1956, 275,000 inmates passed through this remote Siberian prison at the southern tip of the Taimyr Peninsula. During the years of its operation, the winter temperatures here averaged around -30 degrees Celsius. It didn't get much better in the summer, where temperatures were around 10.5 degrees Celsius. The German historian Simon Ernst wrote that for a month and a half every year, the sun simply did not come out, and that in 1946, doctors at the Norilsk hospital were reporting higher rates of psychological illnesses due to the depressing climate and the isolation. Indeed, when a New York Times journalist visited Norilsk in 1936, he remarked that, quote, "Few but explorers have seen that region along the Arctic Ocean above the 62nd parallel. The territory could hardly be more isolated if it were on another planet. So why on earth would anyone want to live here in this godforsaken place voluntarily, let alone build a city? Well, like Magnitogorsk, its existence was necessitated by the USSR's industrial ambitions. Norilsk is an area of incredible rare earth mineral wealth. To help extract these minerals, a gulag was erected to supplement the local labor force. And because the Soviet Union was desperate to increase extraction, you as a gulag laborer could lead a not insufferable existence by being a productive worker. Prisoners here were less likely to die than those in other gulags. That's because by 1953, Norilsk supplied 35% of Soviet nickel, 12% of its copper, 30% of its cobalt, and 90% of its platinum. Its strategic importance meant that Soviet leadership had a vested interest in keeping workers healthy and productive. So relatively speaking, being a prisoner there wasn't too bad. Of course, this isn't saying much. You were still a slave laborer living in what was effectively Satan's freezer. But once the gulag was dismantled in 1956, there were plenty of workers and a large industrial base left behind. It would have been a shame to let that go to waste and leave all those expensive shiny rocks untouched underground. Especially because nickel, the most abundant resource in Norilsk, was vitally important in arms manufacturing and the nuclear energy industry. So important that the CIA found it necessary to keep tabs on the USSR's nickel production. So, a city sprung up out of a gulag. Soon after the closure of the prison, a local factory began producing prefabricated apartments for the newly freed labourers to reside in. All these buildings had to be constructed with reinforced concrete to weatherproof and insulate them against the hostile climate. Which is why today, if you were to visit Norilsk, all you'd see is an ocean of concrete towers. Some of these towers have started to sink with the onset of climate change. The soil in the region, which is usually in a state of permafrost, has started to soften with the rising temperatures, and the foundations of these buildings are becoming unstable as a result. One of the worst ecological disasters in Arctic history occurred in Norilsk for this very reason. In May of 2020, a fuel storage tank at a Norilsk power plant collapsed due to permafrost thaw and lack of maintenance. Around 21,000 tons of diesel oil ran off into the soil and local rivers, worsening the already terrible environmental conditions in and around the city. During the post-Gulag period of the Soviet era, Norilsk was, like Magnitogorsk, a monotown. Its primary purpose was resource extraction. As a result, all other elements of life and urban development played second fiddle to the interests of the city's industrial functions. In 1971, a Canadian delegation exploring the possibility of Arctic development visited the city. Upon their return to Canada, they reported that, quote, "There's a terrific amount of pollution in Norilsk. In fact, you can hardly breathe there. The open pit mining is ugly. We'd have to be more careful about how we do things in our Arctic, and we'd have to have a higher standard of living for the people." It is no surprise then that 52 years later, it was ranked the 10th most polluted city on the planet. Its residents have life expectancies 10 years lower than the average Russian, and the rates of cancer and respiratory diseases have skyrocketed. This is likely due to the high concentration of sulfur dioxide in the atmosphere, courtesy of the heavy industry operations active in the city. Today, the main industry in town is still mining. The local nickel firm, Nornickel, is the city's primary employer and still expanding. Russia, and more importantly the world, is still hungry for raw minerals, and Norilsk still has them in abundance. The fact that climate change is making cities like this more accessible has only made investment pour in further. But this means that for the foreseeable future, Norilsk will remain a monotown that sacrifices comfort and health for industrial productivity. The residents, at least, feel powerless in the face of these vested interests.
Норильский никель, он чувствует себя хозяином полностью на территории, поэтому что-то говорить против они, конечно, боятся. Об этом как бы все знают. Ничего не меняется, никто не протестует.
So, there's very little economic incentive to change anything. The only real newcomers to the economy have been a Bitcoin mining operation, who began using Norilsk's relatively cheap energy grid in 2021. But I personally doubt they're the vanguard of a burgeoning tech sector. As a result, Norilsk today is still an utterly hostile place, especially in winter. The cityscape is dark and desolate, and it just looks like a dystopia. Tell me you'd live here in near perpetual darkness, where your lungs are assaulted by industrial fumes and your water poisoned by diesel, surrounded by the dregs of humanity, unable to leave a place you were never meant to survive in. Where on a dark winter's afternoon, with the cold biting and the wind trying to unravel your coat, the only morsel of light cast across your face on the way home from work at the nickel factory is the soft glow of a Bitcoin sign, framed by smokestacks. In that moment, you might think you are having a nightmare. But no, it's all too real. Somehow, Vorkuta manages to be worse. Like Norilsk, it's a former Gulag city. It sits at roughly the same latitude, is subject to similarly hostile conditions, and is built around resource extraction. In this case, coal. Vorkuta, though, doesn't just look like it's dying, it actually is. In the early 1990s, just after the fall of the Soviet Union, the newly formed Russian state coal monopoly, Rosogol, began shuttering all the unprofitable mines in the country. By 2009, more than half of the mines around the city had been closed, putting thousands out of work. This is perhaps why Vorkuta is the most depressing of the three cities, because at least the residents of Magnitogorsk and Norilsk can find solace in the fact that their suffering has a purpose, that they are tolerating discomfort to build a better life through higher than average wages or a stable industrial job. But in Vorkuta, you get all of the misery of the prior two cities and virtually none of the benefits. Vorkuta slowly became a ghost town. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, people started leaving the city in droves. But as the historian Alan Barenberg notes, it was only those with money that did so. In his words, the cost of moving one's family and possessions by rail had increased significantly. Perhaps most importantly, savings accounts were wiped out by the hyperinflation of the 1990s. While the poor state of the economy led to a significant population decline, it also prevented a mass exodus from the city. So, the only way you could leave was by earning enough money. But of course, you couldn't, because you lived in Vorkuta, where there was no money. This comic tragedy of a situation trapped many people in one of the most depressing cities on Earth. And this time, it didn't even have a job to offer them. In this vacuum, crime exploded. In the newly privatized economy of post-Soviet Vorkuta, people with the resources or connections to do so quickly set about establishing cartels and monopolizing what industry and resources were left. Imports and exports started being controlled by gangs that extracted protection money from businesses. Drug use also increased. Despite the isolation and thus scarcity and costliness of drugs, in 2007, 30% of people in Vorkuta reported taking them. For reference, cities in European and southern Russia with supposed drug problems averaged around 18%. Because Vorkuta was a monotown built around industry, there were barely any social or cultural offerings available. To dull the boredom and isolation, people turned to vice. As a result of these deficiencies, the population fell by 26.6%, or 31,000 people, between 1989 and 2002. For comparison, Norilsk lost 23% in the same time period, but later recovered. Magnitogorsk lost only 5%. The further decline of the economy was prevented in 2003 by the transfer of Vorkuta's remaining coal mines to a private steel and coal conglomerate, who injected investment into the city. However, the population has continued to fade away, largely because automation has cut the job supply. As a result, in 2003, the Russian government sought an $80 million World Bank loan to help people leave the city, to cities like Norilsk, of all places. If you find yourself having to move to Norilsk to pursue a better life, something has gone dreadfully wrong. One can't help but feel that living in Vorkuta today is like living on borrowed time. After all, coal is being phased out all over the world for more sustainable alternatives, and coal is Vorkuta's heart. One day, and one day soon, it'll all be over, and the residents of Vorkuta will wake up and realize that they were atoms living on a dying cell. Thanks again to MyHeritage for sponsoring this video. Click on the link in the description or scan the QR code on screen to get your own DNA testing kit for just €29. Be sure to use the code Imperial at checkout.